The conference room had been designed to impress, all glass walls and polished surfaces, a space meant to project confidence and authority rather than comfort. Long before the meeting began, employees filtered in quietly, choosing seats based on unspoken rules. Everyone understood: closer to the screen if you wanted to be seen as engaged, farther back if you wanted to disappear. The air carried that familiar corporate tension, the kind that settled into shoulders and jawlines whenever senior leadership was scheduled to attend. This was not a room where people spoke freely. It was a room where words were weighed carefully, where expressions were controlled, and where silence often felt safer than honesty. At the head of the table, the chair reserved for the CEO remained empty for a few moments longer than necessary, a small but deliberate reminder of hierarchy. Laptops hummed softly, notebooks lay open, pens were aligned with practiced precision, and conversations stayed low and neutral. Everyone knew what it meant when he was running late. It meant the room would wait, it meant attention would sharpen, and it meant no one would relax until he arrived. When the door finally opened and he stepped in, the shift was immediate. Chairs straightened, back stiffened, and eyes flicked up then away again. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being deferred to, his presence filling the space without effort. And as he took his seat, the meeting officially began, whether anyone felt ready or not. She sat midway down the table, posture composed, hands folded neatly in front of her, eyes on the screen rather than on him. The black employee had arrived early, as she always did, reviewing her notes one last time, checking the figures she had prepared, making sure everything aligned, because she understood the cost of even the smallest mistake. Her reputation in the company was one of reliability and quiet competence, the kind that rarely drew attention until something went wrong. She dressed professionally without excess, spoke clearly, without embellishment, and carried herself with a calm that some mistook for passivity, unaware that it was the product of discipline and restraint learned over years of navigating spaces that were not designed with her in mind. The meeting agenda moved forward methodically at first, updates delivered in measured tones, slides clicked through at a steady pace, and heads nodded at appropriate moments. When it came time for her section, she stood smoothly, connecting her laptop without hesitation, and began her presentation with the same clarity she always brought to her work. Her voice was steady, confident, without being forceful, and as she walked the room through the data, she did not rush, knowing that accuracy mattered more than speed. A few colleagues glanced up with interest, recognizing the quality of her analysis, while others followed along half-distracted, assuming competence without truly seeing it. From his seat, the CEO watched her with an expression that was difficult to read, a slight tightening around the eyes, a hand resting idly on the table as he listened. He had built his career on decisiveness and authority, on being the loudest voice in the room when needed, and he was not known for patience when presentations strayed from his expectations. As she reached a particular slide explaining a delay that had occurred due to factors outside her control, she chose her words carefully, outlining both the cause and the solution with professionalism and transparency. It was the kind of explanation any reasonable leader would appreciate, grounded in facts and forward thinking. The interruption came suddenly, his voice cutting through hers mid-sentence, sharp enough to make several people flinch. He questioned her numbers, not with curiosity but with accusation, his tone laced with disbelief, as if the explanation itself was an inconvenience. She paused, maintaining eye contact without defensiveness, and began to clarify, but he spoke over her again, this time louder, his frustration spilling into the room unchecked. What might have been a Simple requests for clarification turned into a critique delivered publicly, his words carrying weight not just because of what he said, but because of who he was in that room. The shift was palpable. Conversations ceased entirely, laptops stopped clicking, and every eye fixed on the exchange unfolding at the table. She stood there, composed yet visibly aware of the scrutiny, her professionalism tested in real time. She did not raise her voice. She did not react emotionally. Instead, she waited for a break that did not come, for a moment to respond that he did not offer. The CEO leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, continuing his critique as if the audience were irrelevant, as if the impact of his words did not matter beyond asserting his authority. For those watching, the moment stretched uncomfortably, a collective holding of breath as they witnessed something they had seen before in different forms, but rarely so directly. The humiliation was not dramatic or explosive. It was controlled and calculated, delivered in a way that allowed it to be dismissed later as feedback if anyone dared to challenge it. She absorbed it silently, her face neutral, her stance steady, even as the room grew heavier with the awareness that this was no longer just about a presentation. It was about power, about perception, and about how quickly respect could be stripped away in front of an audience trained not to intervene. When he finally finished speaking, the silence that followed was louder than his criticism had been. No one rushed to fill it. No one spoke up. She remained standing, hands still, eyes forward, waiting for permission that should never have been necessary. In that moment, the conference room revealed itself for what it truly was, not a place of collaboration or shared goals, but a stage where authority was enforced and dignity could be compromised without consequence. And as the CEO looked around, satisfied that his point had been made, few in that room realized how profoundly this moment was about to unravel, not just for her, but for him as well. CEO, who never apologized, had built his reputation on certainty, the kind that left little room for reflection, and even less for accountability. Long before he reached the top of the company, he had learned that decisiveness was rewarded far more than empathy, that moving fast and speaking loudly often mattered more than listening carefully. He rose through the ranks during an era that celebrated aggressive leadership, where hesitation was seen as weakness, and public correction was framed as transparency rather than humiliation. By the time he took the helm, his style was already cemented, sharp, uncompromising, and unquestioned by those who benefited from it or feared its consequences. He was known for his intolerance of mistakes, or rather, his intolerance of mistakes made by others. His own missteps were reframed as bold experiments, learning opportunities that demonstrated vision, while errors made by subordinates were often treated as personal failures, evidence that someone had not met his standards. In meetings, he dominated the room with ease, interrupting when impatience set in, steering conversations back to his own conclusions regardless of the data presented. He rarely softened his language, believing that clarity required bluntness, and those around him learned quickly that challenging him openly carried risk. Promotions and opportunities flowed to those who aligned with his tone and cadence, while quieter voices learned to stay out of his way. Apologies, in his view, undermined authority. He believed that leaders who apologized too often invited doubt, that acknowledging harm blurred the line between command and consensus. When confronted with complaints about his demeanor, he dismissed them as misunderstandings or oversensitivity, confident that results justified his methods. The companies Growth under his leadership reinforced this belief. Numbers rising steadily, shareholders satisfied, and the board content to overlook internal tensions as long as performance remained strong. Success became a shield, insulating him from introspection and allowing his behavior to be reframed as necessary toughness rather than something that needed correction. Within the corporate culture he cultivated, discomfort was normalized. Employees learned to brace themselves for meetings, to over-prepare, not because it led to better outcomes, but because it reduced the likelihood of becoming his next target. Mistakes were discussed publicly, praise offered sparingly, and often conditionally, creating an environment where people worked hard but rarely felt secure. This atmosphere rewarded those who mirrored his confidence and penalized those who operated differently, reinforcing a narrow definition of leadership that left little space for diversity of style or perspective. For Black employees, and especially Black women, this environment carried an added weight that went unacknowledged by those who did not have to bear it. Microaggressions slipped through under the guise of high standards. Assumptions about competence surfaced subtly in questions that carried more skepticism than curiosity. The CEO did not see these patterns or chose not to, believing that treating everyone the same absolved him of bias. In reality, sameness ignored context, ignored power imbalances, and ignored the fact that public criticism did not land equally on everyone. What he considered straightforward feedback often carried deeper implications for those already navigating stereotypes and scrutiny. He prided himself on being results-driven, on cutting through what he saw as unnecessary. Sensitivity and his refusal to apologize became part of his brand. Colleagues joked quietly that if he ever said sorry, it would signal the end of an era. Yet beneath that certainty was a fragile foundation, one built on the assumption that his authority would never be questioned and that those beneath him would always absorb the impact of his words without consequence to him. He did not anticipate a reckoning because his experience had taught him that accountability flowed downward, never up or outward. This was the context in which he interrupted her presentation, the lens through which he viewed the moment as routine rather than extraordinary. To him, it was another instance of asserting control, of correcting what he perceived as a flaw in execution. He did not register the room's discomfort or the way his words landed, because he had long since trained himself to prioritize dominance over awareness. In his mind, the meeting would move on, the incident would fade, and his authority would remain intact. What he failed to understand was that authority built without humility was brittle, and that moments like this did not disappear simply because they were familiar. They accumulated, they left impressions, and eventually they created conditions for exposure. The humiliation he delivered that day did not occur in isolation. It was the product of years of unchecked behavior, a pattern mistaken for leadership. And while he believed this moment would pass like all the others before it, he was standing at the edge of a truth he could not yet see, one that would force him to confront not just who she was, but who he had been all along. 3. The meeting that turned public had not been intended to become a spectacle, at least not on paper. It was scheduled as a routine quarterly review, the kind that blended into the calendar, with dozens of others, important but predictable, governed by slides, metrics, and controlled dialogue. Yet the moment she stood at the front of the room, the tone shifted in ways that were subtle at first, the tension threading itself through the air before anyone could name it. She had anticipated questions, even skepticism, and had prepared accordingly, building her presentation carefully to address potential concerns before they surfaced. What she did not anticipate was how quickly professionalism would be replaced by performance, how a single interruption would cascade into something far larger than a discussion about numbers. As she advanced to the slide, outlining project delays, she paused just long enough to frame the context, explaining supply chain disruptions that had impacted timelines across multiple departments, not just hers. Her explanation was measured, factual, and supported by data. But before she could finish the sentence, the CEO leaned forward sharply, tapping the table with his pen. The sound cut through her words like punctuation she hadn't placed there. And when he spoke, his voice carried a familiar edge that many in the room recognized instantly. He questioned why she had not anticipated the delays, why contingency plans had not already been executed, his words phrased less as inquiry and more as indictment. She inhaled quietly and responded with composure, clarifying that contingency measures had been implemented and were already reflected in the revised projections, but he did not let her finish. He interrupted again, this time more forcefully, dismissing her explanation as insufficient and suggesting that her team had been unprepared. The way he said it made the room flinch because the implication extended beyond the project itself, touching on her competence in a way that felt personal rather than procedural. She stood there, shoulders squared, eyes steady, waiting for space to speak, but the space never came. His criticism expanded, moving from the specific to the general, referencing past meetings, minor issues magnified by hindsight, and questioning her leadership in front of colleagues who now stared at the table or their screens, unwilling to meet her gaze. What could have been a private conversation became a public reckoning, and the longer he spoke, the clearer it became that this was no longer about accountability. It was about dominance, about asserting control in a room where he expected compliance. He spoke as though the audience were there to witness his authority rather than engage in problem solving, and in doing so, he transformed the meeting into a stage where hierarchy was reinforced through humiliation. She made a choice in that moment, one that would later define how the incident was remembered. She did not defend herself emotionally. She did not raise her voice or challenge his tone. Instead, she held her ground with quiet dignity, responding only when given the smallest opening, keeping her answers factual and concise. Each time she spoke, he cut her off. Again, and each time she paused without visible reaction, the contrast between their behaviors grew starker. Those watching could not ignore it now, the imbalance playing out in real time, his authority amplified by volume, hers expressed through restraint. The room seemed to shrink as the exchange continued, the walls closing in with the collective discomfort of everyone present. People who had once nodded along now sat frozen, aware that what they were witnessing crossed an invisible line. This was not constructive feedback. This was public chastisement delivered from a position of power, and its impact rippled outward, affecting not just her but everyone who saw themselves reflected in her position. The humiliation was subtle enough to be denied later, yet clear enough to be felt deeply. A reminder of how quickly respect could be withdrawn when it suited those at the top. When he finally paused, breath drawn as if to punctuate his point, the silence that followed was suffocating. She remained standing, her hands still at her sides, eyes forward, waiting for acknowledgement that should have come naturally but did not. No one spoke. No one intervened. The meeting hung suspended in that moment, the air thick with the unspoken understanding that something significant had just occurred. This was no longer a routine review. It was a turning point, one that would echo beyond the conference room in ways no one present fully understood yet. For silence in the room carried a weight that pressed against everyone differently, settling into chests and throats like something solid. It was not the kind of silence that followed reflection or agreement, but the kind born from uncertainty and fear, where every person present understood that speaking could change the trajectory of their own position. Chairs creaked softly as people shifted uncomfortably, eyes fixed on laptops, notebooks, anywhere but on the woman still standing at the front. The air conditioner hummed on, indifferent, its steady rhythm the only sound daring to break the stillness. In that moment, the room was no longer a collective of professionals. It was a collection of individuals calculating risk, deciding whether dignity was worth jeopardizing security. For those seated closest to her, the discomfort was sharp and immediate. They had worked alongside her long enough to know the quality of her work, to recognize that the criticism unfolding had little to do with performance and everything to do with power. Yet knowing that truth did not make acting on it any easier. One manager opened their mouth slightly, then closed it again, the thought of interjecting collapsing under the memory of previous meetings where dissent had been met with public rebuke. Another stared at the agenda on the screen, pretending to read as if focus could shield them from responsibility. The room had learned this behavior over time, trained by repeated examples that silence was safer than solidarity. For others, particularly those newer to the company, the moment served as an unspoken lesson in corporate survival. They watched carefully, absorbing not just what was being said, but what was not. They saw how authority operated when unchecked, how humiliation could be delivered without consequence, and how quickly a room full of people could become complicit through inaction. It was a harsh initiation into a culture that prized results over respect, and the realization settled uneasily, planting seeds of doubt about what kind of organization they had joined. Microaggressions threaded through the exchange in ways that were difficult to isolate yet impossible to ignore. The CEO's language, his tone, the assumptions underlying his questions, all carried an extra layer of scrutiny that did not surface when others presented similar challenges. Words like unprepared and lacking foresight echoed with historical weight, tapping into stereotypes that Black professionals were often forced to work twice as hard to dispel. No one named this aloud. Naming it would require confronting something far larger than a single meeting, and that confrontation felt too daunting, too risky, in a space where authority had already asserted itself so clearly. She felt the silence too, though her face remained composed. She registered the absence of voices that could have supported her, the lack of intervention from peers who knew better, and she understood it not as personal betrayal, but as evidence of a system functioning exactly as it was designed to. This was a room that rewarded compliance, not courage, and expecting otherwise would only deepen the sting. Still, the isolation cut sharply, a reminder that professionalism did not guarantee protection, and that dignity often had to be self-sustained in environments unwilling to uphold it collectively. The CEO interpreted the silence differently. To him, it confirmed his authority, reinforcing the belief that his approach was effective, that no one dared challenge him because his point was valid. He mistook fear for agreement, discomfort for respect, and in doing so, missed the undercurrent of resentment and doubt rippling beneath the surface. The room's quiet became in his mind an endorsement, a sign that his words had landed as intended. He leaned back slightly, satisfied, unaware that the silence he commanded was not loyalty, but restraint. As the meeting moved on, discussion resumed mechanically, voices cautious, contributions measured, as if everyone were walking across thin ice. She returned to her seat when finally permitted, her presence now altered by what had occurred. Colleagues avoided her gaze, not out of disdain, but out of discomfort, unsure how to acknowledge what they had just witnessed without implicating themselves. The agenda progressed, but the energy had shifted irreversibly. No one absorbed the remaining slides fully. Minds replayed the exchange, dissecting it privately, wondering what it meant for them, for the company, for the unspoken rules governing their professional lives. In that silence, something fragile cracked. It was not loud or visible, but it was real, a fracture in the collective belief that merit alone determined treatment, that professionalism was reciprocated, that respect was inherent rather than conditional. The room would eventually empty, chairs pushed back, conversations resuming in hallways and elevators, but the silence of that moment would linger, carried with each person who had chosen not to speak. And while no one knew it yet, that silence, heavy and unresolved, would soon give way to something far louder, as the truth about who she really was began to surface, forcing the room and the man who ruled it to confront the cost of what had been allowed to happen. 5. Who she really was had never been a secret, but it had been carefully contained, shared only where it mattered and withheld where it would have been misunderstood or weaponized. To most people in that room, she was simply another manager, competent, composed, reliable, someone who delivered results without drawing attention to herself. What they did not see, and what she had never volunteered, was the full scope of the path that had brought her there, the depth of experience and authority she carried quietly, because she had learned early that visibility did not always translate into safety. Her resume told a clean, linear story: degrees earned, roles held, promotions justified by performance, but it did not tell the whole truth, not because she was hiding something improper, but because she understood how easily credentials could shift the way people treated her, and she refused to let her worth be reduced to surprise. Before joining the company, she had built a reputation in circles far removed from this conference room, leading complex initiatives that shaped industries, not just departments. She had advised boards, consulted on restructurings, and stepped into failing operations to stabilize them when others could not. Her education came from institutions whose names carried weight in rooms like this one, but she rarely spoke of it, having learned that mentioning it too early often invited skepticism rather than respect. People wanted to be impressed on their own terms, and she had chosen to let her work speak instead, trusting that consistency would eventually be enough. What she had not anticipated was how easily that silence could be misread as limitation rather than restraint. She had joined this company deliberately, drawn by its stated values and the promise of influence rather than title. Her role had been framed as operational, but her mandate extended beyond day-to-day management, touching strategy, long-term planning, and risk mitigation in ways few understood fully. She had been recruited quietly, her presence known to a select group who recognized her expertise and valued her discretion. Those relationships existed, largely outside the view of the broader organization, and she had maintained that separation intentionally, preferring to assess culture before revealing the full extent of her influence. Environments like this, she knew, revealing too much too soon, could shift dynamics in unproductive ways, turning collaboration into competition. What no one in that room realized yet was that her authority did not flow upward from the CEO alone. She reported through channels that intersected with his role, but did not depend on his approval in the way most assumed. Her position was designed to provide oversight as much as execution, to observe how decisions were made, how leaders behaved under pressure, and how culture manifested in moments of conflict. The meeting that had just unfolded was not simply uncomfortable, it was instructive, revealing patterns she had been quietly documenting for months. The public humiliation, painful as it was, added clarity rather than confusion, confirming concerns she had already begun to form about leadership style and organizational risk. She sat there now, outwardly calm, inwardly resolute, understanding that the incident would not remain confined to that room. There were conversations already in motion beyond these walls, emails drafted but not yet sent, observations logged in places the CEO had never needed to consider. Her silence during the meeting was not submission, it was patience, the kind that came from knowing when speaking would distract from the larger truth. She had learned that power did not always announce itself loudly, and that sometimes the most consequential responses unfolded quietly, through processes invisible to those accustomed to control. The truth about who she really was would not surface through confrontation or revelation, delivered dramatically in the moment. It would emerge through consequence, through the slow, inevitable alignment of facts and accountability. The CEO believed he had asserted dominance, that he had reminded the room of his authority, but in doing so, he had exposed himself to scrutiny he could not deflect with volume or confidence. The woman he had humiliated was not simply an employee absorbing feedback. She was a mirror reflecting the culture he had created, and soon that reflection would be impossible to ignore. 6. The information that changed everything did not arrive with drama or spectacle, it surfaced quietly, carried through channels the CEO rarely paid attention to because they operated outside his immediate line of control. It began with a follow-up email circulated to a small group of executives later that afternoon, a routine message on the surface, flagged as confidential, summarizing observations from the morning's meeting. Embedded within it was a request for clarification about decision-making processes, leadership conduct, and risk exposure, phrased in language that was neutral but precise enough to signal concern. The email did not name the incident directly, but anyone who had been present understood exactly what it referenced. And for the first time that day, the narrative shifted away from the CEO's interpretation of events and toward an objective record that could not be dismissed as emotion or misunderstanding. As those messages moved upward, intersecting with governance structures, the CEO rarely had to consider. A different picture of the morning began to take shape. The woman he had publicly humiliated was identified not merely by her title, but by her broader mandate, her role in assessing operational integrity and leadership effectiveness across divisions. For some recipients, this was not new information, but for others, it landed with weight, reframing the incident instantly. What had been perceived by many as a harsh managerial moment was now understood as a data point, a documented example of behavior that had implications far beyond a single meeting. The realization spread quietly, accompanied by an uncomfortable recognition that authority did not flow as simply as the CEO believed. Within hours, private conversations began unfolding in parallel, calls placed, notes compared, patterns discussed. The CEO's conduct that morning was no longer isolated. It was contextualized alongside previous complaints, turnover data, engagement surveys, and exit interviews that had hinted at deeper issues but had never been fully connected. The woman's observations carried particular weight now, not because of surprise at her credentials, but because of the consistency between what she had experienced and what others had quietly reported. Her presence within the organization had always been purposeful, and this moment clarified why she had been positioned where she was, why discretion had been emphasized, and why her perspective mattered. The CEO remained unaware at first, moving through the rest of his day with the same confidence he always carried, assuming the meeting would fade into memory like so many before it. He did not notice the slight shift in tone when colleagues addressed him, the hesitation in conversations that once flowed easily, or the way certain people stopped making eye contact altogether. The information moving behind the scenes did not announce itself to him, and that invisibility reinforced his belief that nothing had changed. In reality, everything had. Decisions were being made about how to proceed, not impulsively, but deliberately, guided by governance frameworks designed for moments exactly like this. By the next morning, the consequences began to materialize in ways he could not ignore. A request for a private discussion appeared on his calendar, sent by individuals he rarely heard from unless something significant was underway. The subject line was neutral, but the timing was not, and as he scanned the invite list, a flicker of unease surfaced for the first time. The woman's name was included not as a subordinate participant, but as an equal voice in the conversation, a detail that unsettled him more than he expected. In that moment, fragments of the previous day replayed in his mind: her composed silence, the room's tension, the lack of immediate pushback he had mistaken for agreement. When the meeting convened, the dynamic was unmistakably different. He entered expecting familiarity, perhaps mild discussion, but was met instead with a measured seriousness that did not bend to his presence. The conversation opened with a review of organizational values, leadership expectations, and risk management principles, framing the discussion in terms he could not easily dismiss. Then, without accusation or raised voices, the incident was addressed directly, his words quoted back to him accurately, stripped of context that might soften their impact. The effect was jarring. Hearing his own language reflected in this way forced a reckoning he had long avoided, revealing how his behavior sounded outside the echo chamber of authority. As the discussion continued, it became clear that this was not about a single lapse in judgment, but about a pattern that had finally reached a threshold. The woman he had humiliated spoke. Then, not defensively, not emotionally, but with clarity and restraint, outlining the implications of public chastisement, the effect on team dynamics, and the broader cultural risks such behavior introduced. She did not mention race explicitly, but its presence was felt in the subtext, understood by those listening without needing to be named. Her authority in that moment was undeniable, grounded not in title alone, but in insight and experience, and for the first time, the CEO grasped the reality that she was not positioned beneath him in the way he had assumed. The truth settled in slowly, unavoidably. She was not simply an employee who could be corrected publicly and moved on from. She was a key voice in evaluating leadership effectiveness, someone whose role intersected with oversight, accountability, and long-term strategy. The humiliation he had delivered so casually had become evidence, and evidence carried consequences. As the meeting concluded, the CEO found himself confronted not with anger or retribution, but with something far more destabilizing: accountability rooted in process, rather than personality. He left that room understanding, perhaps for the first time, that authority exercised without respect did not disappear quietly. It returned amplified, reshaped by those who had the mandate and courage to examine it. 7. The CEO, confronted by reality, did not look like the man who had dominated the conference room the day before. In private, stripped of the audience that had once reinforced his certainty, the confidence he relied on faltered under the weight of facts presented without emotion or exaggeration. He sat back in his chair, arms no longer crossed in defiance, but resting loosely at his sides, listening as patterns were laid out with uncomfortable clarity. What he had dismissed for years as isolated misunderstandings now appeared connected, a trail of data points that traced his leadership style from meeting to meeting, team to team, leaving measurable consequences in its wake. The room was calm, almost clinical, and that calm made it impossible to deflect responsibility with bluster or authority. As the discussion progressed, it became clear that the power imbalance he had once controlled had collapsed. The voices guiding the conversation were not reacting to him, they were evaluating him, measuring his conduct against standards he could no longer redefine at will. He attempted, briefly, to justify his approach, framing his behavior as passion, as commitment to excellence. But the argument sounded hollow even to his own ears when placed alongside retention metrics and first-hand accounts. Each attempt to contextualize was met not with argument, but with redirection back to impact, a word he had often used to justify his decisions, now turned inward with precision. What unsettled him most was not the criticism itself, but the realization that it came from someone he had underestimated so completely. The woman sat across from him, composed and unflinching, not triumphant or defensive, but resolute, articulating her observations with a steadiness that made them impossible to dismiss. She spoke about trust, about how leadership moments reverberated beyond the room they occurred in, shaping what people believed was acceptable or expected. Her words carried authority because they were grounded in lived experience and organizational insight, and for the first time, he understood that her silence during the meeting had not been weakness, it had been restraint. Witnesses to the conversation, executives and board representatives alike, watched the shift unfold with their own sense of reckoning. They recognized how easily they too had accepted the CEO style as necessary, how often results had been allowed to eclipse behavior. The confrontation became collective, not in blame, but in acknowledgement that something fundamental had been overlooked for too long. The company's values, often cited in mission statements and internal communications, were being tested against reality, and the outcome of that test was no longer abstract. By the time the conversation ended, the CEO's authority had not vanished, but it had been redefined. Conditions were set, expectations clarified, and accountability formalized in ways he could not ignore or override. He left the room quieter than he had entered, carrying a realization that could not be undone, that leadership without respect was not strength but risk, and that the woman he had humiliated had become the catalyst for a reckoning far larger than a single meeting. In confronting who she really was, he was forced to confront who he had been, and the truth of that reflection would shape everything that followed. 8. The public reversal did not arrive with grand apologies or dramatic announcements, but with a deliberate shift in tone that everyone present immediately recognized. At the next all-hands meeting, the same conference room filled again, though the energy felt different this time, heavier with anticipation rather than routine dread. People took their seats quietly, glancing at one another with questions unspoken, because word had spread that something had changed behind closed doors. When the CEO entered, he no longer delayed for effect. He took his seat. Promptly, his movements measured, and when he looked around the room, there was a restraint in his posture that had not been there before. He began the meeting by addressing the incident directly, naming it without defensiveness or euphemism. He acknowledged that his conduct in the previous meeting had crossed a line, that his criticism had been delivered in a way that undermined professionalism and respect, and that the impact of his words extended beyond the moment he had intended. Hearing those words spoken aloud in front of the same audience that had witnessed the humiliation sent a ripple through the room. This was not the familiar language of justification or dismissal. It was accountability, imperfect but unmistakable. He then did something that unsettled the room even further. He turned his attention toward her and addressed her not as a subordinate but as a colleague. He acknowledged her expertise, her leadership, and the value she brought to the organization, correcting the record in front of everyone who had seen it distorted. He did not overpraise or dramatize the moment, but the reversal was clear. His earlier narrative replaced with one that recognized her authority and contributions without qualification. The shift was subtle yet profound because it disrupted long-held assumptions about who was allowed to be corrected publicly and who was expected to absorb criticism quietly. She received the moment with the same composure she had shown before, neither gloating nor retreating, simply nodding and thanking him for addressing the issue. Her response was brief, dignified, and devoid of the emotion others might have expected, and that restraint carried its own power. It reinforced that this was not about vindication or spectacle, but about restoring balance and setting a standard. Colleagues watched closely, absorbing the implications, recognizing that something foundational had shifted in how authority could be exercised and challenged. The meeting moved on after that, but the atmosphere remained altered. People spoke more carefully, not out of fear, but out of awareness, and contributions that might have been stifled before found space to surface. The public reversal did not erase what had happened, but it acknowledged it in a way that allowed the organization to move forward without pretending it had never occurred. For many in the room, it was the first time they had seen power corrected openly rather than quietly absorbed, and that image lingered long after the meeting ended. 9. Accountability without applause arrived quietly, without ceremonies or congratulatory emails. And that quiet was intentional. The organization understood now that what had happened could not be repaired with a single public correction or a carefully worded apology, because the harm had not been singular or accidental. It had been structural, reinforced over time by patterns that rewarded certain behaviors while silencing others. Addressing that required more than words. It required changes that would not be immediately celebrated but would be felt gradually, reshaping how power operated within the company long after attention moved elsewhere. Formal reviews were initiated not as punitive gestures but as necessary examinations of leadership conduct and its impact. Policies that had existed largely as statements of intent were revisited with urgency, clarified and strengthened to ensure they carried enforceable consequences rather than symbolic value. Expectations around public feedback were redefined, emphasizing respect, context, and proportionality, and leaders were required to undergo training that addressed not just compliance, but awareness of how bias and authority intersected in everyday interactions. These measures did not generate applause, and they were not designed to. Their purpose was prevention, not performance, and their success would be measured in moments that never escalated rather than moments that demanded correction. For the CEO, accountability became tangible in ways he could not delegate or reframe. Oversight increased, feedback loops expanded, and his leadership was now subject to scrutiny from perspectives he had long dismissed. He was required to engage in structured reflection, guided by external facilitators who were not impressed by titles or past success. This was not humiliation in return. It was responsibility, sustained and deliberate, and it challenged him more deeply than any public confrontation could have. There was no applause when these steps were taken, no narrative of redemption offered prematurely, only the understanding that trust, once fractured, had to be rebuilt through consistent behavior rather than isolated gestures. She continued her work without fanfare, her role unchanged in title, but amplified in influence. Her experience became a reference point in conversations about leadership and culture, not as a story to be retold for inspiration, but as a reminder of why vigilance mattered. She did not position herself as a symbol or spokesperson, resisting efforts to frame her presence as proof of progress, because she understood how easily symbolism could replace substance. Instead, she focused on embedding lessons into systems, ensuring that what she had endured would inform processes designed to protect others who might not have her access or authority. Within teams, subtle shifts began to take hold. Managers became more mindful of how feedback was delivered, colleagues more willing to speak when something felt wrong, and silence no longer carried the same default assumption of safety. These changes did not transform the culture overnight, but they introduced friction where complacency once lived, making it harder for harmful patterns to persist unnoticed. The absence of applause allowed these shifts to take root authentically, unburdened by the pressure to appear resolved or celebratory. Accountability without applause was uncomfortable precisely because it demanded endurance. It required the organization to sit with its discomfort, to acknowledge that progress was ongoing rather than complete, and to resist the temptation to declare victory prematurely. In choosing this path, the company accepted that respect could not be retroactively applied, but it could be enforced moving forward through vigilance and commitment. The incident that had sparked this reckoning receded from daily conversation, but its influence remained, embedded in policies, practices, and expectations that quietly reshaped how leadership was exercised. What mattered most was not that accountability had been seen, but that it was sustained. Applause would have offered closure too quickly, a sense of resolution that reality did not support. Instead, the absence of spectacle allowed the work to continue uninterrupted, grounding the organization in the understanding that dignity was not restored through acknowledgement alone, but through systems willing to change and leaders willing to be changed by them. 10. What the company learned too late was not a lesson about one executive or one incident, but about the cost of allowing patterns to harden into culture without challenge. For years, performance metrics had been used as proof that everything was working. Growth charts and quarterly gains offered as evidence that leadership style did not need examination. The incident in the conference room shattered that illusion, revealing how easily success could coexist with harm, and how long discomfort could be dismissed when it did not immediately threaten the bottom line. The realization came with a sobering clarity that numbers alone were never an adequate measure of organizational health. They learned that silence was not neutrality. The quiet that had filled meetings for years, the hesitation to speak, the avoidance of conflict, had been misinterpreted as alignment when it was in fact self-preservation. Employees had adapted to the environment by shrinking themselves, withholding ideas, and choosing safety over innovation, a reality that did not appear in reports but manifested in attrition, burnout, and missed opportunities. By the time leadership recognized this, talented people had already left, taking with them perspectives the company could not replace easily. The cost of that loss became evident only in hindsight, when gaps appeared that could not be filled by efficiency alone. The organization also learned that values, when left unenforced, became decorative rather than directive. Statements about respect, inclusion, and collaboration had existed for years, yet they had not protected those most vulnerable to power imbalances. The incident exposed how hollow those commitments were without mechanisms to uphold them, and how easily they could be undermined by unchecked authority. It became clear that culture was shaped less by written policies and more by what was tolerated in moments of tension, by who was protected and who was left to endure in silence. Perhaps most importantly, the company learned that diversity without equity was fragile. Hiring talented individuals from varied backgrounds meant little if the environment demanded they absorb harm quietly to succeed. The humiliation of a Black employee in a public forum forced a reckoning with how race, power, and perception intersected within their walls, even when no one named it outright. The organization had believed itself progressive by virtue of representation, but representation alone had not prevented bias from shaping outcomes. The lesson arrived painfully, that inclusion required active maintenance, not passive intent. These insights came too late to spare everyone who had been affected, but they arrived in time to reshape what followed. The company began to understand that leadership was not merely about direction, but about responsibility, and that accountability had to be embedded into the structure rather than activated only in crisis. The cost of learning these lessons late was measured not just in reputational damage or lost talent, but in trust, a resource far harder to rebuild than revenue. In confronting that truth, the organization faced a choice: to treat the incident as an anomaly or to accept it as a mirror. Choosing the latter marked the beginning of a different chapter, one shaped by hard-earned awareness and the understanding that respect, once assumed, had to be earned deliberately every day. When respect becomes non-negotiable, it changes the rules of engagement in ways that are both subtle and profound. The story that began in a glass-walled conference room did not end with an apology or a policy update, because its impact reached far beyond a single individual or moment. It forced a reconsideration of how power was exercised, how silence was interpreted, and how dignity could be compromised under the guise of leadership. The humiliation that unfolded publicly became a catalyst for examining truths that had long been avoided, revealing that respect was not an abstract value but a daily practice that demanded vigilance and courage. For her, the moment affirmed something she had always known but rarely saw reflected back: that her worth was not contingent on recognition from those who underestimated her. She continued her work with the same composure and precision she had always brought to it, but now with the knowledge that her presence had altered the organization in ways that extended beyond her role. She had not sought to be a symbol or a lesson, yet her experience became both, illustrating how resilience and restraint could coexist with accountability and change. Her dignity, preserved under scrutiny, became a quiet standard others could point to when navigating their own moments of challenge. For the company, the lesson was enduring. Respect could no longer be treated as conditional or situational, something offered when convenient and withdrawn under pressure. It had to be embedded into systems modeled by leadership and protected through accountability that did not depend on public outrage or internal politics. The cost of ignoring this truth had been made clear, and the path forward required commitment rather than comfort. In choosing to confront what had been allowed, the organization took a step toward becoming what it had claimed to be, not through perfection, but through willingness to change. Stories like this matter because they reveal how easily harm can hide in familiar routines and how powerful it can be when someone refuses to absorb it quietly. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that dignity should never be optional and respect should never be conditional, then take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These are the stories that challenge complacency and highlight what happens when truth, accountability, and humanity intersect, and they deserve to be carried forward. 11. When respect becomes non-negotiable, it reshapes everything beneath it, not through loud declarations, but through the quiet, persistent refusal to allow power to excuse harm. What began as a moment of public humiliation in a conference room evolved into something far larger, a reckoning that exposed how easily authority could eclipse dignity when left unchecked. The incident forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems they participated in, the silences they accepted, and the assumptions they carried about who was allowed to be questioned and who was expected to endure. In doing so, it revealed that respect was not an abstract principle or a line in a value statement, but a daily choice that demanded consistency, awareness, and courage. For her, the experience did not redefine her worth, but it clarified it. She had entered that room already knowing who she was, already carrying the experience, insight, and authority that others had failed to recognize. The humiliation did not diminish her. It exposed the limitations of the environment around her. By refusing to react in ways that would have satisfied stereotypes or expectations, she protected her dignity and allowed the truth to surface on its own terms. Her composure was not passive, it was strategic, grounded in the understanding that accountability achieved through process and integrity would outlast any momentary confrontation. In the aftermath, she continued her work not as someone transformed by recognition, but as someone affirmed by the knowledge that her presence had forced change without requiring self-betrayal. For those who witnessed it, the story lingered long after meetings ended and policies were revised. It became a reference point, a reminder that silence had consequences, and that neutrality often favored the powerful by default. People began to notice moments they might once have overlooked, to question language that carried hidden weight, to understand that professionalism did not require enduring disrespect. The organization learned, perhaps later than it should have, that culture was not defined by intentions, but by what was tolerated when stakes were high. Respect became something that had to be practiced deliberately, reinforced not only through accountability when harm occurred, but through prevention when tension arose. For the CEO, the reckoning marked a turning point that could not be undone by apology alone. Authority, once exercised without challenge, had been reframed through accountability that demanded self-examination rather than defense. Whether that reckoning led to lasting change depended not on the moment itself, but on the choices made afterward, choices that would be measured quietly over time. The truth he learned was simple, yet destabilizing, that leadership without respect was not strength, but risk, and that power divorced from humility inevitably revealed its own fragility. Stories like this endure because they reflect realities many recognize but rarely see addressed openly. They remind us that dignity is not something to be earned through silence, and respect is not something to be granted selectively. When someone refuses to absorb humiliation quietly, when systems are forced to confront what they have normalized, the impact extends far beyond a single individual or incident. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the moments when respect was withheld or dignity was tested, then take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These are the stories that matter, the ones that illuminate what happens when truth surfaces and respect becomes non-negotiable.